Hello, I'm Malcolm Watson from Aberdeen Beekeepers and welcome back to our Introduction to Beekeeping course. This is week 4, Products of the Hive. It started off as a face-to-face lecture, but we've reworked the session to suit online delivery. So I've been through all the slides and recorded a commentary. I hope you find it useful. So let's start off with revision as usual. So we've got 6 questions on last week's session. Pens and papers ready. Two, three, 4, 5, and 6. So hopefully you've now got a list of answers. I'll show my answers and you can see how you've done. How many frames are there in a nucleus hive? Between 5 and 7. Where is the best place to source bees? Locally. What is the main risk associated with second-hand kit? Is disease. And name 2 problems associated with thick leather gloves. So you could have cleanliness or disease risk, or you can also have loss of dexterity. And name a fuel suitable for smokers, any of those and plenty of others as well. Anything as long as it's natural material. And what is this? A mouse guard. I know Naomi mentioned that last week. So if you got them all right, well done. If you feel the need, you can go back and review last week's session once again after you've watched this one. We're going to cover these 5 topics over the next 55 minutes or so. Everyone knows that bees produce honey, and that's the product that you think of first, but there are in fact a number of other products which we can get from the beehive, which you can keep for your own use or you may be able to sell. First of all, why do we want to keep bees? Historically, bees were kept for honey and for wax. Monks in monasteries were expert beekeepers because they needed a lot of candles in the monastery, and at that time beeswax was the only way to make candles. Many people kept bees to produce honey for sale, and even in living memory it was quite common for farms in this area to keep 1 or 2 hives in order to produce some honey and make a little bit of extra income. These days, the reasons for keeping bees have changed somewhat. A small number of people do keep bees in order to make a living selling honey, but that's the exception, and in order to do that, you'll need to be an expert beekeeper and to keep a very large number of hives. For most people, it's become an interest, a fascinating hobby, which as a byproduct will produce honey, wax, and the other products that I'm going to talk about in this talk. Also, people keep bees because they know that they're good for the environment, and many people want to help with pollination of the plants in their area. Some schools keep bees in order to use them as an educational tool for the students. So how do the bees make honey? Everyone knows that bees collect nectar from plants while they're in flower. Nectar is in fact a dilute sugar solution, and it's specifically designed by the flowers in order to attract the bees and other pollinating insects. Forager bees gather the nectar from the flowers and store it in their honey crops in order to take back to the hive. The bees want the nectar because it's a carbohydrate and is one of their main nutritional needs. When the nectar is stored in the honey crop, they add an enzyme which starts to chemically convert complex sugars in the nectar into simple sugars, such as glucose and fructose, which are easier for the bees to digest. Once the forager's honey crop is full, she will return to the hive and transfer the partly processed nectar from her honey crop to the house bees. I'll show you how they do that in a second. The house bees swallow the nectar into their honey crops and then regurgitate it again, a process which is repeated several times, and this is in order to add more enzymes and to reduce the water content of the nectar. The nectar is hung up to dry in a temporary storage cell, and airflow through the hive reduces its water content. This can be helped by the bees fanning their wings at the entrance if more through draft is required. Once the water content of the nectar has come down to about 18% and the complex sugars have been converted to simple sugars, then it's no longer nectar, it's become finished honey. It's stored by the house bees in a permanent storage location in the comb and sealed with a wax capping. That's then available with a long shelf life for the bees to eat when required. A whole colony of bees might produce 20 to 40 kilograms of honey each year, although each individual worker only makes a tiny quantity in her whole life. Bear in mind that 30 kilograms is not all available to the beekeeper because much of it is consumed by the bees for their own needs and to feed their young. So the thing that differentiates the honeybees from other types of bees is that if the weather is good and there's plenty of forage plants available, they'll keep on gathering nectar and produce a surplus. And that surplus is what allows the beekeeper to take a honey crop. But we're always careful to leave the bees with enough honey stores for their own needs. So you may remember this picture from week 1. This shows the internals of a honeybee, including the digestive system. So this is meant to represent the proboscis, which is unrolled from beneath the bee's head and, like a straw, sucks up the nectar from the flower. It's connected to the esophagus, which feeds back here to the honey stomach. So the nectar passes up the proboscis down to the honey stomach. At the back of the honey stomach here, there's a valve called the proventriculus, which prevents the nectar from moving through to the rest of the digestive system, unless that is required for the bee's own hunger. Once the nectar is in here, the bee adds enzymes which pass through the wall of the honey stomach into the nectar and starts the chemical process that we spoke about to convert the complex sugars into simple sugars. The bee visits many flowers, then when the honey stomach is full, she'll fly back to the hive and she will regurgitate the nectar by forcing it up the esophagus into her mouth. Then one of the house bees, these are younger bees, will place her proboscis into the forager's mouth and suck the nectar or partly processed nectar from her mouth into the house bee's digestive system. This process of regurgitation is repeated several times between different bees in order to add more enzymes. The chemists among you might like this slide. This shows the process of converting complex sugars into simple sugars on the left, and on the right there's an explanation as to why honey is such a good preservative. It has an extremely long shelf life and has actually been used as a natural wound healing compound because it prevents infection. We've got a 5-minute video now which reiterates how bees go about making honey, and there's also some revision from week 1.
The Western or European honeybee pollinates 3/4 of the fruits, veggies, and nuts that we eat. We'd be in trouble without them. Of course, there's a reason we don't call them zucchini bees, almond bees, or apple bees. They also give us honey. One healthy hive will make and consume more than 50 kilograms of honey in a single year, and that takes a lot of work. Honey is made from nectar, but it doesn't come out of flowers as that golden sticky stuff. But after finding a suitable food source, bees dive in head first, using their long, specially adapted tongues to slurp up tiny sips of nectar into one of 2 stomachs. A single bee might have to drink from more than 1,000 flowers to fill its honey stomach, which can weigh as much as the bee itself when full of nectar. Now, on the way back to the hive, digestive enzymes are already working to turn that nectar into sweet gold. When she returns to the hive, the forager bee will vomit the nectar into the mouth of another worker, and that bee will vomit it into another bee's mouth, and so on. This game of regurgitation telephone is an important part of the honey making process, since each bee adds more digestive enzymes to turn long chains of complex sugars in the raw nectar into simple monosaccharides like fructose and glucose. Now at this point, the nectar is still pretty watery, so the bees beat their wings and create an air current inside the hive to evaporate and thicken the nectar, finally capping the cell with beeswax so the enzyme-rich bee barf can complete its transformation into honey. Because of its low water content and acidic pH, honey isn't a very inviting place for bacteria or yeast spoilage, and has an incredibly long shelf life in the hive or in your pantry. Honey has even been found in Egyptian tombs dating back thousands of years, pretty much unspoiled. Although I wouldn't personally eat it, just in case. For 1 pound of honey, tens of thousands of foraging bees will together fly more than 3 times around the world and visit up to 8 million flowers. That takes teamwork and organization, and although they can't talk, they do communicate with body language. Foragers dance to tell other bees where to find food. A circle dance means flowers are pretty close to the hive, but for food that's farther away, they get their waggle on. The waggle dance of the honeybee was first decoded by Carl von Frisch, and it's definitely one of the coolest examples of animal communication in nature. First, the bee walks in a straight line, wagging its body back and forth and vibrating its wings, before repeating in a figure 8. Now, whatever angle the bee walks while waggling tells the other bees what direction to go. If it's straight up the line of the honeycombs, then the food is in the direction of the sun. If the dance is pointed to the left or the right, the other bees know to fly at that angle relative to the sun. The longer the waggle, the farther away the food is. And the better the food, the more excited the bee shakes its body. If that's not amazing enough, even if they can't see the sun itself, they can infer where it is and the time of day by reading the polarization of light in the blue sky. A single bee is a pretty simple creature, but together they create highly complex and social societies. There's 3 main classes in a beehive: drones, workers, and queens. Now when a new queen is born, she immediately runs around and kills her sisters because there can be only one. Now, during mating season, she'll fly to a distant hive to mate with several males and store away their sperm, which she'll use back at her home hive to lay more than 1,000 eggs a day throughout the rest of her life. Any unfertilized eggs, those that don't join up with sperm, will mature into male drones, which means they only have one set of chromosomes. But fertilized eggs are all genetically female. They're destined to become either queens or workers. Now, queens do the egg laying, of course, but worker bees are the backbone of the beehive. So what makes most females become workers while just one wears the hive crown? A baby bee's diet activates genetic programming that shifts its entire destiny. Every bee larva is initially fed a nutrient-rich food called royal jelly. But after a few days, worker bee babies are switched to a mixture of pollen and honey called bee bread. But queens eat royal jelly their whole life, even as adults. Scientists used to think it was just royal jelly that put queens on the throne, but just last year, they discovered one chemical in bee bread, the food that queens don't get, that keeps worker bees sterile. Being a queen seems to be just as much about what bees don't eat as what they do. Making honey is insect farming on its grandest scale, with intricate societies cooperating to make a food fit for bear tummies big and small, with the pleasant side effect of pollinating most of the world's flowering plants. I'd say it's a pretty sweet deal. Stay curious.
So thank you to PBS. I hope you enjoyed that. Just one small correction. Queens don't normally fly to a distant hive in order to mate. In fact, the queens and the drones meet at a drone congregation area. In week 2, we spoke about the main forage plants and their time of flowering through the year. I'm just going to relate that now to the honey crop. So here's some of the main forage plants flowering through the year. And notice that this blue line represents the total population of bees in the hive. So there's much more bees in the summer than there is in spring and autumn. So the early forage, the snowdrops and the crocus, there's not many foragers available to collect that nectar. So there's never going to be a large quantity of honey. Likewise, at the end of the year, when the bees are collecting ivy here, they need to lay in stores to see the colony through the winter. So there's never going to be a surplus of ivy honey that the beekeeper can take off. Traditionally, the main honey crop was taken in the summer after the clover and the lime. This was known as the main flow. So any plant which flowers in July could be harvested in August. There's plenty of bees at that time, so there's a strong workforce to collect the nectar and to produce honey. The population of bees is starting to drop off, so there is likely to be some surplus of honey in the hive. If you keep the bees in a place where there's oilseed rape available, then you may be fortunate to get a surplus of oilseed rape honey. There is a special consideration here because oilseed rape honey granulates very quickly, so it's not possible to leave that until August in the hive before it's taken off. It would granulate long before then. So if you're looking for a oilseed rape honey crop that's taken in late May before it granulates, OSR stands for oilseed rape. Also, if you're keeping the bees in a place where they can collect heather honey and you're fortunate enough to have a surplus, then that would be collected after the heather in late September or early October. So those are the 3 potential honey harvests that you might be taking. Do remember what I said before, that at all times we always leave the bees with enough honey for their own needs. Now we're going to look at how beekeepers process the honey. This is a video that was prepared by the Scottish Beekeepers Association, which runs through the process from taking the honey off the hive to getting it into the jar.
The beekeeper's now going to take off some honey. There's some ripe honey, so he's going to take it off. So first he has to clear the bees out of the super, out of the honey box. And he does that by using these little one-way valves. So the way they work, the bees go down through the hole and then they go out between these little springs. They move apart to let the bee out, and now the bees can't get back in. So it's like a one-way valve. It only lets the bees go out of the super, it won't let any back into the super. So he puts 2 of these into a clearing board, and now he goes into the hive. So this is the super he wants to clear. So he simply lifts the super and he puts a clearing board under it. And puts on the top, and the bees will now feel that they're trapped, so they'll go down through these little porter bee escapes, we call them, these one-way valves, and when the beekeeper comes back in 24 hours, the super will be clear of bees and he can lift it off and take it away to extract it. 24 hours later, we come back to take off the honey super, and we check that the super is bees, and indeed there's hardly any bees in there, so we can lift it off and take it away and extract it. So we've now taken the box of honey, the super of honey, back to the processing room, and here we have the frames of honey, all sealed with the little wax cappings. So what we'll do first, we'll uncap the honey, and so we uncap using a knife that's been heated in hot water so that it doesn't get too sticky, and then I'll slice off the cappings. So I try and take off the minimum possible so as not to take too much honey. And here we are slicing them off. And we just have a filter cloth here that the cappings go into, and any honey will run through into the bucket below, and we can collect that later. Okay, so we have to do the other side because there's a mid-rib of wax, and the bees build comb little cells out from each side, so we need to uncap both sides. And once we get it uncapped, we put it into a centrifugal spinner, spins it round at high speed, and the centrifugal force spins out the honey out of the cappings and leaves the cappings empty. Now it's uncapped, so we're ready to put it into the extractor, and it'll go into the extractor like so, and as it rotates, the little cells are pointed slightly upwards towards the top of the frame. The bees do it that way to hold the honey in when they're processing it, and because it's like that, we can spin it at high speed and the honey will fly out from both sides of the frame. This is called a radial extractor. Okay, so now we do the second one. So exactly the same process. That's what that is. And that's us ready to put the second frame in. Right, so now we've got 9 frames uncapped, that's what the extractor holds, and we've got them all loaded in, and we're now ready to start it spinning out the honey. get rather sticky doing this. The beekeeper's wife always notices that all the doorknobs on her doors get very sticky when the beekeeper's extracting honey. So there it is, we can see it flying out. If you look down the side, maybe you can just see it. Maybe the light's not good enough.
There you can see it.
Now we can show it's empty. So the cells are now all empty of honey, and we can give them back to the bees, and they can store more honey. So now we've extracted the honey in the extractor, and it's all in the bottom of the drum here, and we're going to filter it for honey. So we put it through a coarse stainless steel filter first, and then a fine stainless steel filter, and finally through a 300 micron filter cloth. So we put them in here, and we open the valve in the bottom of the extractor, and this valve, beekeepers have a special name for honey valves. They call them honey gates because they're made for handling viscous fluids. They slice the fluid off when they're closing. So we open the honey gate, and out comes the honey into the filters, and we just give it time to go through the filters, and then we would leave it for perhaps a day or two for any air bubbles to come up out of it, because in spinning it out in the extractor it will have added a little bit of air, so we wait till the air bubbles come out, and then it's ready to put into jars that you see in your supermarket. So there we are, that's most of it out. So we can now shut the honey gate and leave it to go through the filters. Now we're going to bottle or jar some of the honey. So we take the jar and we open the honey gate, and out it flows, fills up the jar. The beekeeper checks the weight, make sure he's got the correct weight. That one's good. Now we do another one, and that's the honey in the jars. So we put on the tops, and now we put on our labels. Our label needs to state that it's honey, Scottish honey in this case, and the name of who's producing it or packaging it, and the weight, 227 grams, half a pound, the best before date, and that's the honey now ready for the market. Lovely Scottish honey.
So thank you to Alan Riach for that video. Ordinarily we would show you examples of the equipment that we use for this job. That's not going to be possible today, so here's some pictures. You saw the extractor that Alan used. So this is a manual tangential extractor, 3 frames. We've got various tools for removing the wax cappings from the frame. So Alan used a knife like this. You can also use a comb like this, or this is an electrically heated knife which does the same job. So those are all for removing the wax cappings. The double sieve that you saw Alan using, and this is a bucket which has got a valve on it. Usually we would transfer the honey from the extractor through a filter into a bucket, and then let it settle for a while so as the air bubbles are removed before bottling up in the jars. All this kit costs money, of course, but you don't need to buy this initially. The association owns equipment like this, which is available for loan to new beekeepers. Here's some examples of the different colours that liquid honey can turn out from different flowers. We don't know exactly what these are, but the lighter ones might be oilseed rape or lime perhaps, and the darker ones might be horse chestnut. You probably already have some thoughts on what your favourite kind of honey is. Do you like liquid or soft set? Maybe you like comb honey. One of the beauties of being a beekeeper is that you can produce the kind that you like best. So I'll say a few words about the different types of honey now. Whatever form you choose to sell your honey in, it will have the same composition and the same nutritional value. Liquid honey is probably the most common form. Everyone's seen that. It can be eaten as it is, it can be added to hot drinks, and it can be used as an ingredient in baking in place of sugar. It's clear and runny, and the colour depends on the plants that the bees have been on. If you see honey described as Scottish honey or blossom honey or Aberdeenshire honey, that means it's a mixture of flowers, and the beekeeper's not been able to specify exactly which plant. The honey can only be described as a single plant, such as, for example, lime honey, if it is predominantly from that plant. And in summer that's quite hard to do because there's so many different plants in flower. It must be less than 20% water composition. That's important for the honey lasting, but it will crystallize in time. So when honey crystallizes and starts to solidify, that is a natural process. It doesn't mean there's anything wrong with the honey, and it's still edible, but it doesn't look good. So the beekeeper will try to avoid that happening and to sell the honey before it has crystallized. People often ask what soft set honey is. So this can be made from liquid honey by the beekeeper by processing it before sale. What we do is to seed the honey with a small quantity of existing crystallized honey, which has the right size of crystals in order to produce a nice fine soft set finish. This is a matter of personal taste. Some people prefer liquid honey, some prefer soft set. This is not so good for baking, but it does have the advantage that it doesn't fall off your toast in the morning. In the past, this was extremely popular. These are sections of honey, so a special frame containing a number of these small wooden boxes would be used in place of the normal frame supers, and the bees would draw those out and the sections would be sold as a premium product. They're not so popular now. This is cut comb honey, so using unwired foundation, the beekeeper has cut a section out of the frame after the bees have filled the honey and capped it, and that's sold usually in a transparent plastic container like this. Many people like this. It does mean that you have to eat the wax as well as the honey, and wax is not digestible, it just goes straight through you, but it doesn't do you any harm. And that's a matter of taste. If you can't decide which kind you like. One option is to sell chunk honey. So this is a jar of liquid honey into which a piece of cut comb honey has been placed. Then you get the best of both worlds. And I have seen this for sale locally. Once you have your honey crop and you've bottled it up, you've given some to your family and friends, you may have some left which you want to try and sell. So you ask yourself, what price can I sell my honey for? If you have a look at the shelf in your local supermarket, you'll see that the lowest cost honey is described as non-EU blend, and that sells for around about £2.50 a pound. Scottish honey in the supermarket might be £7 or £8 a pound, and another pound or two for heather honey, which commands a premium. And the top of the range is New Zealand Manuka honey, which sells in small jars for the equivalent of about £25 a pound, because it's believed to have such strong medicinal properties, even stronger than normal honey. So, like many agricultural producers, beekeepers are competing against low-cost imported product. The empty jar and the label will cost around 50 pence. And on top of that, you need to add the cost of feeding the bees, the cost of treating the bees, and of course the cost of all the equipment that you've had to buy to produce the honey in the first place. Most people will try to sell their honey for around about £5. This seems to be the level that most people are happy to pay for locally produced honey. They know they can get it cheaper in a supermarket, but they understand it's not the same thing. Some people will find a small local shop that's willing to take their honey. Some will take a stall at a farmer's market, and some will sell it to friends and family. And of course, you occasionally see signs at the side of the road for honey for sale. That only works if you live on a main road. When you're selling honey, it needs to look right, so you've got to be careful producing the honey to avoid air bubbles or other contamination, and you need to have a good label. You'll want to design your own label, or you can buy pre-made ones, but it's important to differentiate the product as a quality locally produced honey. The size of the jar is important. Traditionally, honey was sold in £1 jars, but there's been a trend towards smaller jars, and these examples here are 340 grams, which is 12 ounces. And the reason for that is that customers, as I said, are happy to pay about £5 for a jar of honey if it's locally produced, but that seems to apply whether the jar is £1 or 12 ounces. So that's the reason, for economical reasons, a lot of beekeepers have moved from pound jars to the 3/4 pound jars. There are regulations that you need to follow if you're selling honey. That's the detail there for the Scottish Government honey regulations, which are actually the same as the UK regulations. I won't go through them in detail just now because that's a subject in itself, but suffice to say that the honey needs to be accurately named. It has to have composition which complies with the legal standards, including water content. It has to have the right information on the label, including the weight of the honey, the beekeeper's address, and the use-by date, and it needs to have been produced in a hygienic way. Let's go on now and talk about wax products. Beeswax is complicated chemically, but it's important to bear in mind that it is a natural product, so all the chemical components within it are also natural. The melting point is 62 degrees C, but it is flammable, so there's some safety precautions that we need to follow when we're processing the wax. It can't be heated directly. Solid wax needs to be melted either in water or over a double boiler or bain-marie. This stops it accidentally igniting. By the way, this shows wax being expressed by a bee. There's wax glands on the lower side of the abdomen. You can see that when the wax first comes out, it's actually transparent, but then a little while later it turns the yellow colour that we know so well. For the beekeeper, wax is a valuable commodity. We don't get very much of it, so any spare brace comb or old combs that the bees are not using anymore needs to be put aside, and then when you've collected enough of it, you can do some wax processing. I'm going to show you another video now. This lady is not a beekeeper. She's actually talking about making furniture polish, but it's a good description of how to render down old comb into blocks of wax, and then she goes on to talk about making polish.
There's a couple of different ways to acquire solid beeswax, from specialty woodworking stores to apiaries to health food stores. But if you happen to know someone who works with bees, you can render wax from honeycombs directly. And that's what we'll cover how to do in this video. The wax is distributed throughout the honeycomb, so in order to separate it, you need to first boil it in water. To make it easier to separate the unwanted solids from the wax, I first wrapped the comb in some cheesecloth. I had both large chunks of honeycomb as well as some processed, and I wrapped both up in a couple of packages to make it easier to deal with. Now once you have a simmer, you can start adding the honeycomb. It's quite bulky at first, so you can add more to the water in stages as it softens up. As it boils, the honeycomb breaks down quite a bit, and the water turns oily and yellow. Once the wax is rendered and you can squeeze no more wax out of the cheesecloth, pour the wax water into plastic containers and let it solidify. You can see here the wax floating to the surface and any solids falling to the bottom of the water. At this point it's still quite dirty and you need to further clean the wax to be able to use it. To clean the wax, first remove the wax cake from the dirty water. Then remelt it in a double boiler so any solids or dirt fall to the bottom again. To further clean it, you can gently pour the wax through a filter. Here I'm using a coffee filter, and make sure you only use a dedicated filter for this, since the wax is very difficult to clean off completely. Once the wax is clean to your satisfaction, you can pour it into molds or paper cups. Now that you have clean wax, there are lots of things you can use it for. However, I'm going to turn it into wax polish, which can be used on furniture, woodworking projects, metal, and more. To make linseed oil beeswax polish, I first melt the wax again over a double boiler, and then I combine 4 parts raw linseed oil with 1 part wax by volume. Then I slowly heat that until combined and pour into containers. Once the wax has solidified, it's ready to be used for any project. Now, beeswax is really cool for a lot of uses. Rendering your own wax is quite interesting, however you need quite a lot of honeycomb to render a decent amount of wax. But if you have access to some, then why not try it? Plus it gives you a lot of control in terms of the purity of the wax.
So now we know how to turn old honeycomb into blocks of solid beeswax. A word of warning here. Processing honey is quite messy. There's a tendency to make everything in the kitchen sticky. Processing wax is really messy. So you may have noticed that the lady in that video was working in a workshop, not in her kitchen. That's a good idea if you can manage it. Candles are probably the best known wax product. Once you have your stock of nicely cleaned rendered wax, you could produce either molded or dipped candles. Molded candles are made by pouring molten wax into a silicone mold, which is then removed after the wax has hardened, and in this way intricate shapes can be produced. Dipped candles are made by dipping a wick again and again into a vat of molten wax. Each time the wick is removed, a little more wax sticks to it, so that after a long time a candle is built up. This is the method that used to be used by the monks in the monasteries. It is rather messy. The third method, these are rolled candles, and these don't need your own supply of wax. They're made by rolling up a piece of unwired foundation that you've bought in with a wick in the center. So that is the easiest way to make a candle, and it's a popular thing for school children to do. There is a market for solid blocks of beeswax. They're normally sold in small bars, which are 1 ounce or 30 grams of wax. And these are used by leather workers for lubricating thread and for many other purposes that require natural lubrication. They're also bought by people who wish to make their own cosmetics. The video demonstrated how to turn beeswax into furniture polish that can be sold in jars or in tins. A number of cosmetics can be produced by beekeepers using the wax, and the method is fairly similar to making polish. Other products. We've covered those, so now I'm going to say a few words about mead, pollen, propolis and royal jelly, all of which are produced by the hive, and also about the possibility of selling the bees themselves. So mead is an alcoholic drink, sometimes known as honey wine. It's produced using honey and water, and it's fermented with yeast. It can be flavoured with fruits, spices, grains or hops. There's very many different kinds of mead. In fact, there's probably a kind of mead that you would like if you look into this. We know that bees collect pollen from flowers as an essential part of their nutrition, and they carry it back to the hives on their back legs. There is a market for pollen. It's sold in health food shops as a diet supplement, and these days it's also used as a flavouring for gin. It is possible to strip the pollen off the bees' legs as they're returning to the hives and to collect it at the entrance. But it's important not to do too much of that because it could harm the bees. So remember, they need the pollen for feeding their young. If you do want to collect pollen using a pollen collector at the hive entrance, only do it for 1 or 2 days on each hive, and after that, let the bees keep the pollen for their own use. Propolis, as we know, is produced by the bees if we leave a space which is less than 1 bee space, and they seal the gaps to prevent drafts or predators from getting into the hive. It's usually seen as a nuisance by the beekeeper. However, there is a number of products which are made from propolis, so in theory there is a market for it. It's used on the body externally as a balm. It's taken internally as a health supplement, which is available in health food shops again, and it's also used to make the special varnish that is put onto violins. You'll remember that the workers produce royal jelly in order to feed the young larvas, and in particular the young queens. This is a very nutritious foodstuff, and it has been discovered that it is good for your complexion. So a number of cosmetics are available which include royal jelly as one of their components. This is not for the hobby beekeeper, however, as producing a large number of queen cells in order to obtain a large quantity of surplus royal jelly would be rather a specialized thing to do. Some beekeepers supplement their earnings from selling honey by selling bees. There's always a strong demand for nucleus colonies, especially in the spring. A colony of 5 frames with a laying queen will sell for around £100. And the key here is that in order to sell nukes, the beekeeper has to have an established reputation as someone who keeps healthy bees with good characteristics, especially their temper. But if you know that you have bees like that, then sometimes there's a surplus of stocks, and this is definitely a good way to earn additional money. Likewise, sometimes we need replacement queens. They can be lost due to accident, or sometimes the beekeeper wishes to buy additional queens in order to change the genetics and improve the quality of their stocks. So we can go to a beekeeper who we know keeps good bees and buy a queen who will already have been mated and proven to be laying properly. She'll have been marked, and that'll probably cost £30 or £40. So that's another possible source of income. One way to see lots of products of the hive is to attend a honey show. These are held by most beekeeping associations in the autumn at the end of the beekeeping season. So there's different classes for different types of honey. You can see a number of classes here, and you will notice that some of these honeys have been awarded a red ticket, which is the first prize in the class, and there's other colours of ticket for the other prizes. There's always a great competitiveness to see who can get the first prize. In addition to the open class, there will be a special class for novice beekeepers so that they can win prizes as well. And entering these shows is good fun, as well as being a way to improve your honey processing skills. As well as the bottled honey, there'll be classes for frames of capped honey. There's also wax classes for candles and blocks. You can see here some molded candles. And there is additionally baking classes where honey is used instead of sugar as the sweetening ingredient. Sometimes the recipe is given as part of the show rules, and sometimes the entrant can make up their own recipe. There's also sometimes classes for crafts which are linked to beekeeping and photographs. So if you've not been to one before, attending a honey show is a great way to see all the products of the hive, and the Aberdeenshire beekeepers hold one in the autumn each year. We've covered all 5 topics now. I hope you found that useful and interesting, although I do realise that this is an area where you really need to build your skills by practicing rather than by watching a presentation or reading a book. So I encourage you to try processing some honey or making a candle, and that way you will learn a lot more about it. If you do have questions, I know that the association is organising a question and answer session, and I hope you'll be able to attend that. The next talk in this series is going to be What's Wrong with My Bees with Graham Torrey. So that's it. Thank you very much for listening, and goodbye.